here we turn to the fiscal policy. Well, we can't really talk about the fiscal policy for 2021-22 without joining it to the previous year, because it's all become, in a sense, one large policy response. In 2020-21, the fiscal policy response to the COVID crisis when it first hit was to introduce JobKeeper, a wage subsidy for employers, JobMaker, which is a subsidy to employ people under the age of 35, an apprenticeship subsidy, coronavirus supplements to welfare recipients, easing the restrictions on withdrawals of superannuation, accelerating the depreciation deductions that can be made on capital spending by firms, and one-off payments to small to medium-sized enterprises to help them with their cash flow. So here we see really a set of policy responses that are driven by a concern to maintain employment and to prevent businesses from going under. When we turn to the most immediate budget, 2021-22, we can see in the budget papers that the government has said it has a two-phase strategy, really. And it says the first phase of the strategy focuses on driving down the unemployment rate back to where it was prior to the pandemic or lower. And second, the medium-term strategy is to grow the economy in order to achieve a balanced budget and then reduce public debt as a share of GDP. So it would seem that the government, at least in the short term, was intending to stimulate economic growth, to get the unemployment rate down, to get the economy back on track, a higher growth rate, which will then enable the government to start to eventually generate budget surpluses. The big ticket items in the 2021-22 budget were, JobKeeper was replaced by called specific sectoral help. Subsidies for particular sectors of the economy, such as tourism, for example, although not tertiary education. Business tax relief over the forward estimates, bringing forward personal income tax cuts for households, increased spending on infrastructure over the next 10 years, increased expenditure on apprenticeships and training places, and new spending on social services, such as for aged care, mental health, the NDIS, childcare, and women's support. So the impact on the budget balance of these large expenditure items has been considerable. For the 2020-2021 budget, expenditure was greater than receipts or revenue to the tune of $161 billion. In the 2021-22 budget, the budget deficit is projected to be $106.6 billion. These are very large budget deficits, but they're not astronomical by any means, certainly not by international standards. If we think about the budget deficit relative to the size of the GDP, then we would say that for 2021, it was 7.8% of GDP, and for the 2022 or 2021-22 budget, it's 5% of GDP. These are not remarkably large numbers by international standards. So is the government's fiscal policy stance expansionary or contractionary? Well, we don't think about the fiscal policy stance in terms of simply whether there's a budget deficit or a budget surplus. Roughly speaking, a fiscal policy stance, whether it's contractionary or expansionary, is indicated by the change in the size of the budget balance. In this case, the budget deficit. A budget is classified as expansionary if the budget deficit increases year on year, and it's contractionary if the budget deficit decreases year on year. So if we look at the government's projections over time, we get a fairly clear sense of the fiscal policy stance that the government is taking. If we go from starting with 2020-21, we can see that the government is seeking to or planning to reduce its budget deficit year on year into the future, and in some long distant future to eventually get to a budget surplus. So we can see that here we would say, roughly speaking, that the fiscal policy stance is actually contractionary. If we want to be more technically specific about it, an expansionary fiscal policy stance is one in which the structural budget deficit increases. And the fiscal policy stance is contractionary if the structural deficit decreases. What do we mean by a structural deficit? Well, this is the deficit that would be due only to discretionary decisions made by the government. That is, what the deficit would be after you remove the effect of automatic stabilizers that come into play due to cyclical changes in the economy. If we look at this graph here from the budget papers, we can see that the government has broken up the budget deficit into three components: the cyclical factors, the structural budget deficit, and the temporary fiscal measures. Now, if we think of it in this way, then we can see going from 2020-21 to 2021-22 that the structural budget deficit has gotten larger, in which case we would say that there is expansionary fiscal policy based on this definition. And thereafter, it starts to become contractionary. However, one might also argue that these temporary fiscal measures which have been introduced in green are in fact discretionary parts of the budget. Those discretionary components of the budget could be added to the structural components to give the overall discretionary effect. And if we do that, then we can say that clearly over the entire period from 2020 onwards, you have a fiscal policy stance which is clearly contractionary, without ambiguity about it.